My mother slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table and announced with a perfectly straight face that she was giving the $62 million skincare empire I built from scratch to my younger sister. My father simply patted my shoulder and told me to step down gracefully because my sister had a family to feed while I was just a single woman in a penthouse. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just smiled, signed the papers, and walked out. What they did not know as they smugly popped champagne was that they had just acquired an absolutely worthless empty shell. 7 months later, they were standing in my lobby begging me to save them from total financial ruin. Before I get into the details of this story, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had your family betray your trust to favor their golden child. Trust me, you are going to want to stick around for this ending because it is incredibly satisfying. My name is Claire and I am 35 years old. I was sitting in the sleek glass-walled conference room of Lumiere Botanicals, the organic luxury skincare company I literally built from nothing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling skyline of Chicago stretched out below us, a testament to how high I had climbed. The room smelled faintly of lavender and cold-pressed rosehip oil, the signature scent of my best-selling serum. I had called this meeting to discuss our fourth-quarter projections. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Across the table sat my mother, Susan. She was wearing her signature pearl necklace and a designer suit she had bought using the corporate credit card I gave her. Next to her sat my 32-year-old sister, Megan, who was busy inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. I noticed the tension in the room immediately, but I assumed my mother was just going to ask for another increase in her monthly dividend. When I was 19 years old and still living in my college dorm room, I started mixing natural skincare formulas. I spent every waking hour researching botanicals and saving every penny from my waitressing job to buy ingredients. When I finally needed $10,000 to run my first real production batch, my mother offered to invest. In exchange, she had her lawyer draft a boilerplate contract that gave her a 51% controlling stake in the company. I was young, naive, and completely trusted my family, so I signed it without a second thought. For 15 years, she never lifted a finger to help run the business. She just collected her massive dividend checks while I worked 80-hour weeks building Lumiere into a global brand. I never fought her on the ownership percentage because I believed blood was thicker than water. I realized how stupid that was the moment she slid that heavy manila envelope across the table. I asked her what the documents were. She did not even blink. She folded her hands on the table and looked me dead in the eye. She told me these were the official transfer papers. She announced that she was legally transferring her entire 51% controlling stake to Megan. But she did not stop there. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the top page and calmly stated that she was also using her majority shareholder voting power to strip me of my title as Chief Executive Officer. I sat there frozen, staring at the legal jargon on the pristine white paper. The words blurred together. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I asked her to repeat herself, thinking I must have misunderstood. My mother let out an exaggerated sigh, as if my confusion was a massive inconvenience to her day. She leaned forward and explained her reasoning with chilling precision. She said it was time for a change in leadership. She claimed that Lumiere Botanicals needed a fresh perspective and that Megan was perfectly positioned to take the brand to the next level. I looked at Megan. My sister had never worked a day in her life. She dropped out of college after 2 semesters to marry her husband Jamal. Since then, she had spent her days going to Pilates classes and posting aesthetic photos of her matcha lattes on social media. She did not know the first thing about supply chain logistics, organic chemical formulation, or managing a team of 200 employees. She could not even balance her own personal checking account without calling our father in a panic. I asked my mother how she could possibly justify this. I reminded her of the 15 years I sacrificed. I reminded her of the missed holidays, the sleepless nights, the times I slept on the floor of our first tiny warehouse to make sure orders shipped on time. I built this company with my own 2 hands while Megan was out partying and maxing out credit cards. Megan finally looked up from her nails and offered me a sickeningly sweet smile. She tilted her head and adopted a soft, condescending tone. She told me I was overreacting. She said I had done a decent job getting the company off the ground, but it was time for someone with a real lifestyle aesthetic to be the face of the brand. She actually had the audacity to reach across the table and pat my hand, telling me I could stay on as a senior consultant if I really wanted to. My mother quickly intervened before I could respond. Her voice grew sharp and defensive. She told me I needed to look at the bigger picture. She launched into a speech about family duty and sacrifice. She said Megan had 3 young children to feed and a massive mortgage on a new house she could barely afford. She pointed out that Jamal was struggling with his real estate business, and their family needed stability. Then my mother looked at me with absolute contempt. She gestured up and down at my tailored suit and said I was 35 years old, single, and living in a luxury penthouse. She essentially told me I had too much and my sister did not have enough. According to her twisted logic, I did not need a multi-million-dollar company because I did not have a husband or children to support. She framed her hostile takeover as an act of maternal fairness. She believed she was Robin Hood stealing the empire I built to subsidize my sister's lavish lifestyle. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I looked at the 2 women sitting across from me and suddenly saw them for who they truly were. They were not family. They were parasites who had finally decided to kill the host. The sheer entitlement radiating from them was suffocating. They actually believed they could just walk in and take 15 years of my life simply because they shared my DNA. The legal documents sat between us. A single signature line waited for me to formally acknowledge the board resolution and step down. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I felt a cold, sharp clarity washing over me. I remembered exactly how I had structured my business over the last 5 years. I remembered the separate legal entities, the hidden clauses, and the intellectual property rights. I realized in that exact moment that my mother had made a fatal miscalculation. She was so blinded by greed and favoritism that she never bothered to read the fine print of what she actually owned. I stared at the pen in my hand, thinking about the day I bought it to sign my very first commercial lease. Every milestone of my adult life was tied to Lumiere Botanicals. I knew every employee by name. I knew the exact temperature our mixing vats needed to reach to perfectly blend the shea butter and botanical extracts. I had nurtured this brand like a child, and now my own mother was ripping it out of my arms to hand it to the sister who had always been the golden child. Growing up, it was always like this. If I won a science fair, my parents would quickly change the subject to praise Megan's new dance routine. When I bought my first apartment with my own money, my parents complained that I was being flashy while Megan was struggling to pay rent. My success was always viewed as a threat to Megan's happiness. I spent my entire life trying to earn their approval by being the perfect daughter, the perfect student, the perfect provider. I let my mother take 51% of my life work because I desperately wanted her to feel proud of me. Looking across the mahogany table at her cold, calculating eyes, I finally understood that nothing I did would ever be enough. I would always be the workhorse expected to plow the fields so Megan could feast. But today, the rules of their game were going to change. I uncapped the silver pen. The metal felt cool and solid against my skin. I did not say another word about fairness. I did not waste my breath trying to explain my value to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I leaned over the table and signed my name on the dotted line, officially resigning as the Chief Executive Officer of Lumiere Botanicals. I pressed the pen down hard, making sure the ink bled perfectly into the paper, giving them exactly what they demanded. I slid the freshly signed documents back across the mahogany table. My mother snatched them up instantly, with her eyes gleaming in a greedy kind of triumph. She did not even offer a simple thank you. She just began organizing the pages into a neat little pile, as if she had just finished a routine trip to the bank. My father, Richard, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally decided to speak. He stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from his golf shirt, and walked over to pat me firmly on the shoulder. He told me I was doing the right thing. He said I was finally acting like a mature adult, and that I should be immensely proud of myself for securing my sister's future. He actually had the nerve to tell me to stop being so selfish with my success. According to him, giving away my life work was the bare minimum I owed the family. Jamal leaned back in his leather executive chair, interlacing his fingers behind his head. A smug, arrogant smirk was plastered across his face. He looked me up and down and thanked me for doing the right thing for the family legacy. He told me not to worry, and that he and Megan would take real good care of my little lotion business. He was a man whose own real estate ventures had completely tanked, and yet he was sitting in my boardroom acting like he was a corporate titan who had just orchestrated a brilliant buyout. I did not give them the satisfaction of an argument. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my suit, and picked up my designer coat from the back of the chair. I looked at the three of them sitting around the table they had just stolen from me. I offered them a bright, genuine smile that seemed to deeply unsettle my mother. I looked right at my sister and told her congratulations. I told her the company was all hers now, and I wished her the best of luck with the Q3 vendor renewals. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass-walled conference room. I did not look back. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I pulled out my phone and did something I should have done a decade ago. I opened my contacts and permanently blocked my mother's number. Then I blocked my father, my sister, and Jamal. I deleted their contact information entirely. I stepped out of the building and took a deep breath of the crisp Chicago air. I did not feel a single ounce of grief or regret. For the first time in 15 years, I felt completely liberated. I walked straight to my luxury SUV and drove to an upscale steakhouse downtown. I ordered a dry-aged ribeye and a glass of expensive Cabernet. I sat alone in a leather booth and silently toasted to my newly found freedom. They thought they had just ruined my life. They thought they had left me with nothing. But they had absolutely no idea what they had just signed up for. The next morning, I walked into the sleek downtown offices of my corporate attorney. David was a ruthless, brilliant lawyer who had helped me structure my business empire 5 years ago when Lumiere Botanicals first started generating massive international revenue. When I sat down in his office and told him I had officially handed over my CEO title and my mother's 51% share to my sister, he actually let out a loud laugh. David opened his laptop and pulled up the master corporate structure for my portfolio. This was the secret my family was too lazy and too arrogant to ever uncover. Lumiere Botanicals. The company they now proudly owned was nothing more than a marketing and retail shell. It owned the logo, the office furniture, the employee laptops, and the lease on the building. That was it. 5 years ago, on David's advice, I had created a completely separate holding company, legally registered solely under my name. That holding company owned the actual chemical patents for every single skincare formula. It owned the manufacturing rights. Most importantly, it held the exclusive ironclad contracts with the European organic farmers who supplied our rare botanical ingredients. My mother had given away an empty box wrapped in shiny paper. Lumiere Botanicals legally had to pay my holding company a massive licensing fee every single month just to use the formulas I invented. Without my permission, Megan could not produce a single drop of serum. She could not order a single ounce of rosehip oil. She had zero intellectual property. David poured us both a cup of coffee and smiled. He reminded me that the primary licensing agreement between Lumiere Botanicals and my holding company was set to expire at the end of the second month. He asked me if I planned on renewing it for the new CEO. I took a sip of my coffee and calmly told him to terminate the contract the second it expired. I instructed him to cut off their access to the formulas and to send a formal legal notice to the European suppliers that my holding company was suspending all shipments to Lumiere Botanicals. Over the next 2 months, I watched their complete delusion unfold from a distance. I had created a burner social media account just to keep an eye on the impending train wreck. Megan and Jamal wasted no time treating the Lumiere Botanicals corporate bank account like their own personal piggy bank. Megan posted endless photos of herself flying on chartered private jets to luxury resorts in Aspen. She bought a brand new imported sports car and tagged the location as her new CEO celebration gift. She posted videos walking through my old office holding a designer handbag, pretending to look over financial charts she could not even begin to comprehend. Jamal was even worse. He posted videos of himself smoking expensive cigars on the balcony of their new overpriced mansion, bragging about generational wealth and hard work. He filmed himself shopping for custom-tailored suits, talking to his followers about how easy it was to dominate the corporate world when you had a winner mindset. He was playing the role of the successful businessman, while entirely funding his lifestyle with the liquid cash reserves I had carefully built up for emergency operational costs. They were blowing through the company funds at an astonishing rate. They were so busy playing pretend executives that they never bothered to read the vendor contracts or the supply chain agreements. They were living in a fantasy world funded by my money, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to midnight. They assumed the business would just magically run itself on autopilot while they reaped the rewards. They had no idea that a catastrophic supply chain collapse was speeding straight toward them, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. Exactly 2 months after the boardroom ambush, the first domino finally fell. Megan had spent her first 60 days as chief executive officer taking long lunches, treating her friends to expensive dinners on the corporate card, and conducting glamorous photo shoots in my old office. But eventually, the illusion of leadership had to face reality. The quarterly production orders were due, and the inventory warehouses were starting to look noticeably bare. Megan sat down with the financial ledgers and decided she was a business genius. She looked at the massive invoices from our organic farmers in France and Italy and gasped at the cost. In her mind, I was just an idiot who was drastically overpaying for basic ingredients. She immediately canceled the pending raw material orders from my holding company, assuming she could just source the materials herself and pocket the difference. She found a discount bulk supplier overseas that sold synthetic chemical alternatives for absolute pennies on the dollar. She ordered massive vats of cheap lab, created chemicals to replace the rare botanical extracts I had spent 15 years carefully sourcing. She thought she was maximizing profit margins to fund her new lavish lifestyle, but she quickly hit a massive brick wall. Having the ingredients was only step one. She needed my proprietary blending instructions to actually make the products. Jamal, who had officially appointed himself as the new chief financial officer, despite having a completely failed real estate background, decided to throw his weight around. He picked up the phone and called the head of our French distribution and manufacturing center, a no-nonsense man named Laurent, who had worked closely with me for over a decade. Jamal tried to bark orders at him. He demanded that Laurent release the formulation blueprints and immediately begin processing the new cheap synthetic ingredients that Megan had purchased. Laurent simply laughed on the phone. He calmly informed Jamal that his manufacturing facility did not work for Lumiere Botanicals. He explained that their exclusive manufacturing contract was held entirely by a private holding company owned by Claire. Laurent told Jamal that since Lumiere Botanicals no longer had an active licensing agreement with my holding company, they were legally forbidden from accessing the manufacturing facilities, the supply chain logistics, or the formulation patents. Jamal tried to threaten him. He screamed into the phone that he would sue the manufacturing plant into the ground. Laurent just hung up on him. Jamal was furious, but he was also completely desperate. Instead of admitting defeat to the board of directors or swallowing their immense pride and calling me to beg for the licensing rights, they made the absolute worst decision possible. They decided to guess. Megan and Jamal secretly hired a discount manufacturer in a neighboring state to blindly mix their cheap synthetic chemicals together, hoping it would somehow smell and feel like my original luxury skin serum. They poured millions of dollars from the company liquid cash reserves into a massive, desperate production run. They rushed the packaging and shipped the new unverified products out to our biggest retail partners. The new batches hit the shelves of luxury retailers like Sephora and Neiman Marcus within weeks. Almost immediately, disaster struck. Without the exact temperature controls, the precise blending measurements, and the high-grade organic botanicals, the synthetic chemicals reacted terribly with each other in the bottles. The signature serum did not smell like lavender and cold-pressed rosehip oil anymore. It smelled distinctly like industrial floor cleaner. Customers who had been fiercely loyal to Lumiere Botanicals for years purchased the new bottles and applied the serum to their faces expecting the usual glowing results. Instead, social media exploded with absolute horror stories. Influencers began posting viral videos crying and showing off severe chemical burns, angry red rashes, and massive cystic breakouts caused by Megan's cheap synthetic batch. The hashtag Boycott Lumiere started trending globally on every major social media platform within 48 hours. The luxury retailers did not hesitate for a single second. Sephora and Neiman Marcus immediately issued nationwide product recalls and pulled every single Lumiere Botanicals item from their pristine shelves. They formally canceled all future purchase orders and demanded immediate full refunds for the defective inventory. The company bank accounts were slammed with millions of dollars in retailer chargebacks overnight. The $62 million brand valuation I had meticulously built over a decade began bleeding out like a severed artery. While they were busy burning my legacy to the ground, I was quietly building my next empire. I had already secured a private state-of-the-art laboratory and officially launched my new ultra-premium wellness brand called Auralab. I utilized my own patents, my exclusive supply chain network, and my loyal European vendors to create a product line that was even better than before. My top clients and elite dermatologists abandoned Lumiere instantly and followed me to my new venture. I was thriving independent and completely untouchable while my family was drowning in a nightmare of their own making. Month 4 arrived and the situation went from bad to completely catastrophic. Class action lawsuits began pouring in. Angry customers were hiring aggressive personal injury lawyers to sue Lumiere Botanicals for the severe chemical burns and permanent skin damage caused by Megan's gross negligence. Jamal was in a state of sheer panic. When he took over the finances, he had arrogantly co-signed on several predatory business loans using his own personal assets as collateral, assuming the company revenue would easily cover the monthly payments. Now the company had zero revenue coming in and massive legal bills piling up. Jamal finally realized he was in way over his head and hired an independent forensic accountant to figure out how to salvage the business. The accountant spent 3 days going through the corporate structure before delivering the devastating realization. He sat Jamal down and handed him a folder showing that Lumiere Botanicals was entirely worthless. They owned the logo, they owned the office chairs, and they owned millions in debt. They owned absolutely zero intellectual property. My business phone started ringing constantly. I let every single call go to voicemail. I sat in my penthouse sipping a glass of wine and listened to the frantic audio messages left by my father Richard. His voice went from commanding and authoritative to angry, and finally to utterly terrified. He told me that Megan and Jamal were fighting non-stop. He confessed that the company accounts were totally frozen and that his own retirement funds were now being threatened because he had personally guaranteed one of Jamal's reckless business loans. He begged me to pick up the phone and fix the family mess. I simply deleted the voicemails and poured myself another glass of wine knowing the real confrontation was just around the corner. The heavy glass door of the conference room clicked shut behind me, sealing away the toxic energy that had suffocated me for my entire life. I walked down the long corridor of the executive floor, my heels sinking into the plush carpet I had personally selected 3 years ago. Through the glass walls of the open concept workspace, I saw dozens of my employees typing away at their desks, completely unaware that the company they loved had just been handed over to a woman who did not even know how to use a spreadsheet. I offered a warm smile to my executive assistant as I passed her desk. She looked slightly confused by my sudden departure, but I did not stop to explain. I simply kept walking toward the private elevator, feeling lighter with every single step. When the silver elevator doors slid closed, shutting out the Lumiere Botanicals logo on the wall, I finally let out a long breath. Anyone else in my position would have collapsed against the handrail, Anyone else would have burst into tears or screamed in frustration after having their $62 million life work stolen by their own mother. But as the elevator rapidly descended toward the lobby, I looked at my reflection in the polished mirrored panels, and I did not see a victim. I saw a woman who had just dropped an unbearable weight. For 15 years, I had been carrying the massive burden of my family's financial expectations and emotional manipulation. Now they had voluntarily taken that burden from my shoulders. I stepped out into the grand marble lobby of the building and waved goodbye to the front desk security guard. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, late afternoon air of downtown Chicago. The city was bustling with rush-hour traffic, and the setting sun was casting a brilliant golden glow against the skyscrapers. I pulled my phone from my designer handbag. The screen was already lit up with a new text message from my mother. It was a brief, condescending note telling me to be sure to drop off my corporate credit card and parking pass by the end of the week. She added a little heart emoji at the end, as if stealing my company was just a minor administrative update. I did not reply. Instead, I tapped on her contact profile, scrolled down to the bottom of the screen, and pressed block caller. A small red confirmation popped up, and I accepted it without a second of hesitation. I felt a sudden rush of pure adrenaline. I went to my father's contact and blocked him too. I blocked Megan. I blocked Jamal. I systematically went through my digital life and severed every single connection to the people who had just betrayed me. I deleted their numbers entirely, wiping them from my phone and my life. It was the most empowering action I had ever taken. I was 35 years old, and for the first time I was completely unreachable to the people who only saw me as a bank account. I walked a few blocks to the private executive parking garage where my luxury SUV was parked. The attendant brought my sleek black vehicle around, and I slipped into the driver's seat. The rich smell of the pristine leather interior surrounded me. I pressed the ignition and the powerful engine roared to life. I merged onto the busy downtown streets, blending into the sea of evening commuters. As I drove, I thought about my 20s. I thought about the decade I spent isolated in laboratories, missing out on vacations and relationships while I built the empire Megan was currently sitting in. My parents had always made me feel like my hard work was just my duty to the family. They conditioned me to believe that my worth was tied entirely to my ability to provide for them. But as I navigated the Chicago traffic, I realized they had actually done me a massive favor. By forcing me out, they had unknowingly severed the invisible chains of guilt that had kept me tied to them for so long. I no longer had to endure passive-aggressive family dinners. I no longer had to listen to my father praise Jamal for a mediocre real estate deal, while ignoring my international retail expansions. I was finally free. I pulled up to the valet stand of one of the most exclusive high-end restaurants in the city. It was a place where getting a table usually required a month of advance notice, but the maitre d' knew me well. He greeted me warmly by name and immediately escorted me to a quiet private booth tucked away in the back corner of the softly lit dining room. The atmosphere was incredibly elegant, with soft jazz playing in the background and the subtle clinking of crystal glasses filling the air. I sank into the velvet cushions of the booth and opened the leather-bound menu. When the sommelier approached my table, I did not order my usual glass of modest red wine. I asked for a bottle of their most expensive vintage champagne. I ordered half a dozen fresh oysters, top-tier caviar, and a perfectly cooked, dry-aged ribeye steak. When the waiter poured the sparkling golden champagne into my crystal flute, he smiled and politely asked what I was celebrating on a random Tuesday evening. I picked up the glass, watching the delicate bubbles rise to the surface. I looked at him with a completely genuine smile and told him I was celebrating an early retirement. He congratulated me and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I took a sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid wash over my palate. The food arrived, and it was absolutely spectacular. I sat there in the luxurious restaurant, enjoying every single bite, feeling completely relaxed and at peace. I knew exactly what my family was doing at that very moment. I knew they were probably ordering expensive takeout to the conference room, laughing and celebrating their brilliant corporate takeover. I knew Megan was already picking out the new luxury car she was going to buy with the company funds. And Jamal was probably updating his social media profiles to call himself a venture capitalist. They were so incredibly arrogant. They were so blinded by their own greed and their lifelong assumption that I would just quietly take whatever abuse they dished out. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had secured a lifetime of effortless wealth and pushed me out into the cold. But as I finished my steak and poured myself another glass of champagne, a slow, confident smile spread across my face. I was calm because I was not a woman who had just been robbed. I was calm because I was a woman who had just handed her abusers a beautifully wrapped, ticking time bomb. They thought they owned a $62 million empire, but they had no idea how I had structured the business over the last 5 years. They had no idea about the hidden clauses, the holding companies, or the intellectual property rights. I had left them sitting in an empty glass box, and the clock was already ticking down to their absolute destruction. And the best part was that I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. All I had to do was sit back, sip my champagne, and watch them press the detonator all by themselves. I woke up the next morning without an alarm clock for the first time in 15 years. The morning sunlight was streaming through the massive windows of my penthouse, illuminating the quiet space. Usually by 7 in the morning, I would already be answering dozens of urgent emails, negotiating with suppliers, or putting out corporate fires. Today, my phone was completely silent. I laid in bed for a long time just staring at the ceiling, soaking in the profound peace that comes from knowing you are no longer responsible for the happiness of ungrateful people. I took my time getting ready, choosing a sharp-tailored blazer and my favorite designer heels. I was not going to the office today. I had a much more important meeting to attend. I drove my luxury vehicle downtown into the heart of the financial district. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the bright morning sky. I handed my keys to the valet and walked into the grand marble lobby of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. I was there to see David, my lead corporate attorney. David was a ruthless, brilliant legal strategist who had been by my side since my company first hit the $10 million revenue mark. He was exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted in your corner, and the exact kind of enemy you never wanted to make. His assistant escorted me into his spacious corner office. David was sitting behind his massive oak desk, reviewing a stack of contracts. He looked up, smiled, and gestured for me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. He asked his assistant to bring us 2 espressos before closing the heavy wooden door to give us total privacy. David leaned back in his chair and asked me how the third quarter projections were looking for Lumiere Botanicals. I took a slow sip of the rich, dark espresso. I looked him right in the eye and casually informed him that I really had no idea how the projections were looking because as of yesterday afternoon, I was no longer the chief executive officer of the company. David froze. His coffee cup hovered mid-air. He slowly lowered it back onto its matching saucer and stared at me in complete silence for a few seconds. He asked me to repeat what I had just said. I maintained my calm demeanor and explained exactly what had happened in the conference room. I told him about the ambush. I explained how my mother had weaponized her 51% legal stake to force me out and transfer complete control of my life work to my sister Megan. I described the smug look on my brother-in-law Jamal's face and my father's ridiculous demand that I step aside to secure Megan's financial future. For a brief moment, David looked genuinely furious on my behalf. His jaw tightened and he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. He asked me why I signed the transfer papers without calling him first. He told me we could have fought the board resolution or tied them up in litigation for years. I smiled and shook my head. I told him I did not want to fight them. I told him I gave them exactly what they asked for. David studied my face carefully. He knew me well enough to know I was not a woman who simply surrendered. Slowly, the anger left his eyes, and a knowing grin began to spread across his face. He let out a loud, sudden laugh that echoed in the large office. He spun his chair around and quickly typed his password into his computer. He opened the encrypted master file that contained my entire corporate portfolio and turned the large monitor so we could both see the screen. He pointed to the organizational chart we had meticulously designed together 5 years ago. This was the absolute masterpiece of my business strategy and the ultimate secret weapon my family was too arrogant and too lazy to ever uncover. 5 years ago, when Lumiere Botanicals started experiencing massive international growth, David had warned me about my mother's majority stake. He told me that leaving 51% of a highly valuable company in the hands of an absentee investor who happened to be my mother was a massive liability. He advised me to protect myself. And because I was the sole inventor of the product formulas, I had the legal right to do exactly that. Looking at the screen, David reviewed the genius of our setup. Lumiere Botanicals. The company my mother and sister now proudly owned was nothing more than a hollow marketing and retail shell. On paper, it looked incredibly impressive. It owned the beautifully designed logo. It owned the lease on the expensive downtown headquarters. It owned the office furniture, and it employed the marketing staff. It also held the massive corporate credit card debt that Megan and Jamal were currently racking up. But Lumiere Botanicals did not own a single piece of intellectual property. Years ago, I had established a completely separate private holding company registered solely under my name. I was the absolute sole proprietor of this holding company. My mother had no shares in it. Megan had no access to it. Jamal did not even know it existed. And this private holding company was the actual vault. It legally owned the complex chemical patents for every single skincare serum, lotion, and cleanser in our product line. It owned the exclusive manufacturing rights with the top-tier laboratories. Most importantly, my holding company held the ironclad legal contracts with the European organic farmers who supplied the rare botanical ingredients that made our products so effective. My mother thought she was a brilliant mastermind orchestrating a hostile takeover to secure generational wealth for her favorite daughter. In reality, she had just handed Megan an empty cardboard box with a fancy label slapped on the side. David could not stop smiling as he clicked through the legal documents. He reminded me that Lumiere Botanicals only operated because it paid my private holding company a massive monthly licensing fee for the right to use my formulas and access my supply chain. Without that licensing agreement, Lumiere Botanicals legally could not produce a single drop of serum. They could not purchase a single ounce of organic rosehip oil. They were entirely paralyzed. Because my mother had never actually worked a day in the business and only cared about cashing her dividend checks, she had never bothered to read the annual financial audits. She never looked at the vendor contracts. She just assumed I was doing all the heavy lifting and that the money would magically keep flowing forever. Megan and Jamal were even worse. They were so blinded by the glamour of the chief executive officer title that they never requested a forensic accounting review before accepting the transfer. David pulled up the current licensing contract between the two entities. He highlighted the expiration date. The primary licensing agreement was set to expire on the final day of the second month. He looked at me over his glasses and asked what I wanted to do when the deadline arrived. I leaned back in the plush leather chair and crossed my legs. I told David that under no circumstances were we going to renew the contract. I instructed him to terminate the licensing agreement the absolute second it expired at midnight. I told him to draft a formal legal notice to our European suppliers and our manufacturing laboratories, informing them that my holding company was immediately suspending all shipments and production services for Lumiere Botanicals. David nodded eagerly, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he took notes. He added that we should also prepare a massive stack of cease and desist letters just in case Megan and Jamal tried to steal the formulas or illegally replicate the products using our trademarked branding. I agreed completely. I wanted an ironclad legal wall built around my intellectual property. We spent the next 2 hours finalizing the strategy. We mapped out every single legal trapdoor my family was about to fall through. We prepared for the moment they would inevitably realize they had zero assets and millions of dollars in operational liabilities. By the time I stood up to leave David's office, I felt an incredible surge of power. I shook David's hand, thanking him for his brilliant foresight 5 years ago. He walked me to the door of his office and told me it was going to be an absolute pleasure executing this legal strategy. He promised to keep a close eye on the financial filings of Lumiere Botanicals and alert me the moment they started to panic. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back into the bright city streets. I knew exactly what was happening across town. Megan was likely sitting in my old chair spinning around and taking selfies to post online. Jamal was probably bragging to his golf buddies about his new corporate empire. They were completely intoxicated by the illusion of victory. But their victory was a house of cards resting on a table that I exclusively owned. All I had to do now was wait for the clock to strike midnight at the end of month 2. Then I would simply pull the table out from under them and watch the entire spectacular collapse. I went back to my penthouse and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I opened my laptop and created a blank anonymous social media profile. I had blocked my entire family from my personal accounts, but I needed to keep a close eye on their public movements. I needed to document their reckless behavior just in case they tried to blame me for the financial ruin they were about to cause. It took less than 5 seconds to find Megan's profile. Her account was completely public, and she was posting updates every single hour. It was honestly fascinating to watch someone destroy a multi-million-dollar company in real time. The very next morning, Megan posted a video of herself strutting into the Lumiere Botanicals headquarters, wearing a ridiculous hot pink designer suit that cost more than most of my warehouse employees made in a month. She had hired a personal camera crew to follow her around for her first week as chief executive officer. She filmed herself sitting in my custom ergonomic chair, pretending to look at a spreadsheet she clearly did not understand. She had changed her social media bio to read self-made entrepreneur and skincare visionary. It was absolutely pathetic. By the end of the first week, the real spending began. I knew exactly how much liquid cash I had left in the corporate accounts. I had kept a healthy reserve of $3 million specifically earmarked for our upcoming European supplier invoices and our seasonal marketing push. Megan and Jamal looked at that reserve and treated it like a personal lottery jackpot. Megan posted a series of photos from the first-class cabin of a flight to St. Bart's. She claimed she was going on a much-needed corporate retreat to brainstorm new product ideas. In reality, she was just drinking expensive champagne and staying at a luxury villa that cost $10,000 a night. She brought her 3 kids and a full-time nanny, all paid for by the company credit card. She posted shopping haul videos from high-end boutiques, showing off diamond tennis bracelets and custom leather handbags. She actually bought a brand new imported sports car and parked it right in front of my old office building, captioning the photo with a quote about how hard work always pays off. Jamal was somehow even more insufferable. He had officially appointed himself as the chief financial officer of Lumiere Botanicals, despite having absolutely no background in corporate finance or the beauty industry. His real estate business had been a complete failure, but now he was playing the role of a massive venture capitalist. He posted daily videos of himself smoking imported cigars on the balcony of the downtown office. He filmed himself shopping for custom-tailored suits, talking directly to the camera about his elite mindset and his aggressive investment strategies. He actually hired an interior design firm to completely gut and remodel the executive floor. He threw out the beautiful, understated furniture I had carefully selected and replaced it with flashy, tacky marble desks and velvet couches. He hosted lavish, catered lunches for his old fraternity brothers, charging thousands of dollars in prime rib and expensive scotch to the company expense account. They were throwing massive parties to celebrate their new wealth while completely ignoring the actual daily operations of the business. My parents were entirely complicit in this grand delusion. My mother, Susan, posted a long, rambling status update praising Megan for her incredible business acumen. She bragged to all her country club friends about how her youngest daughter was single-handedly taking the skincare world by storm. My father, Richard, posted pictures of himself driving Megan's new sports car, grinning like a teenager. They were all participating in a collective fantasy, completely blind to the fact that they were rapidly burning through the only safety net the company had. I watched all of this unfold from the comfort of my own home. I did not feel a single drop of jealousy or anger. I just felt a deep, profound sense of validation. My parents had always painted Megan as the responsible one, the loving mother who just needed a little bit of financial help to get ahead. They painted Jamal as a misunderstood genius who just needed the right opportunity to shine. But given absolute power and a massive bank account, they immediately proved exactly who they were. They were greedy, incompetent narcissists who cared more about looking rich on the internet than actually running a sustainable business. While they were busy bleeding the company dry, I was quietly building my future. I spent my days having long video calls with my European organic farmers. Because my private holding company held the exclusive contracts with them, they were completely loyal to me. I explained that I was stepping away from Lumiere Botanicals and launching a brand new ultra-premium wellness line called Aura Lab. Without a moment's hesitation, they agreed to follow me. They promised to reserve their highest quality botanical yields exclusively for my new venture. I started designing new packaging, securing a private laboratory, and hiring back the elite chemists who had quietly resigned from Lumiere the moment they realized Megan was in charge. As the weeks rolled by, the situation at Lumiere Botanicals grew increasingly absurd. I could see the cracks forming behind their glossy social media posts. Several of my former mid-level managers reached out to me through private messages, begging me to come back. They told me that Megan had not attended a single supply chain meeting. They told me that Jamal was aggressively denying purchase orders for basic office supplies while simultaneously approving his own massive expense reports for luxury dinners. The staff was panicking because the inventory levels in the warehouses were dropping rapidly, and nobody in leadership was authorizing the replenishment orders. My family was entirely oblivious to the massive legal cliff they were rapidly approaching. They were so distracted by their new cars, their private flights, and their designer wardrobes that they never even looked at the foundational vendor contracts. They assumed the business would just automatically generate revenue forever. They thought the organic rosehip oil and the lavender extracts would just magically show up at the manufacturing plant the way they always did. They did not realize that the primary licensing agreement between Lumiere Botanicals and my private holding company was expiring in a matter of days. That single piece of paper was the only thing keeping their entire empire afloat. Without it, they had no right to my proprietary chemical formulas. Without it, they could legally not instruct the manufacturing plant to produce a single bottle of the signature serum that accounted for 80% of their retail revenue. I sat on my penthouse balcony watching the city lights flicker to life against the night sky. The end of the second month was only 48 hours away. Megan had just posted another video this time showing off a massive diamond necklace she bought to celebrate her second month as a self-made boss. I smiled and closed my laptop. Let her enjoy the necklace, I thought. She was going to need something expensive to pawn when the reality of her incompetence finally came crashing down. Exactly 60 days after the boardroom ambush, the clock struck midnight, and the primary licensing agreement officially expired. I was sitting on my sofa reading a book when my phone vibrated with a single text message from my attorney, David. It simply confirmed that the formal termination notices had been legally served to the corporate office of Lumiere Botanicals. I smiled, turned off the lamp, and went to sleep feeling incredibly peaceful, knowing the invisible safety net I had woven for my family over 15 years was finally gone. The next morning, reality began to aggressively knock on my sister's door. The extravagant spending spree Megan and Jamal had been on for the past 2 months had taken a massive toll on the company cash reserves. Jamal had drained millions to fund their private jets, luxury vehicles, and pointless office renovations. The limitless corporate credit cards were suddenly inching very close to their maximum limits. At the exact same time, the quarterly production run was urgently approaching. The warehouse manager sent Megan a frantic email with a red urgent flag stating that their inventory of the signature botanical serum was dropping below critical levels. The top-tier retail partners were waiting for their seasonal shipments, and the shelves were getting dangerously bare. For the first time since stealing my title, Megan actually had to sit down at my old desk, look at a financial spreadsheet, and do some actual work. She opened the vendor files and reviewed the upcoming invoices from our exclusive organic farmers in France and Italy. To a woman whose greatest financial achievement was marrying a man who faked his wealth. The cost of high-grade organic ingredients looked absolutely absurd. She saw the price of pure cold-pressed rosehip oil, genuine lavender extract, and ethically sourced squalane, and she immediately assumed I was just an idiot. She called Jamal into the office and pointed at the computer screen. She told him that I was a terrible negotiator who had been getting scammed by European farmers for over a decade. She genuinely believed that luxury skincare was just a massive marketing trick, and that the actual product inside the bottle did not matter as long as the packaging looked expensive. Megan decided right then and there that she was going to prove to our parents that she was a true business genius. She wanted to show them that she could slash operating costs, drastically increase the profit margins, and keep funding her designer shopping sprees without breaking a sweat. Instead of reaching out to renegotiate with my premium suppliers, she went online and started searching for discount bulk chemical manufacturers. It did not take her long to find a massive factory overseas that produced cheap synthetic alternatives for the beauty industry. Instead of the delicate organic botanical extracts I had spent years researching, she ordered huge industrial vats of petroleum-based fillers, artificial chemical fragrances, and harsh synthetic preservatives. She bought the absolute lowest-grade ingredients legally allowed in commercial cosmetics. She paid pennies on the dollar for toxic materials that were typically used in cheap dollar store lotions. Jamal was absolutely thrilled. As the self-appointed chief financial officer, he immediately signed off on the massive purchase orders. He patted Megan on the back, praising her for her brilliant cost-cutting strategy and her aggressive corporate mindset. They calculated the new profit margins on a whiteboard and realized that by using these garbage ingredients, they could pocket millions of dollars in instant cash. They celebrated their brilliant corporate pivot by booking a weekend trip to a luxury resort in Miami, completely oblivious to the catastrophic chain reaction they had just initiated. Megan assumed that our fiercely loyal customer base would simply not notice the difference. She thought that women who spent hundreds of dollars on premium skincare were just shallow consumers paying for a heavy glass bottle and a shiny gold foil logo. She fundamentally misunderstood the entire industry and the empire I had built. My customers did not buy Lumiere Botanicals because of the clever marketing campaigns. They bought it because the organic formulas actually worked. They bought it because it healed their skin, cleared their complexion, and contained absolutely no harsh chemicals. But Megan did not care about the product or the consumer. She only cared about the profit margin to sustain her newly stolen lifestyle. She arranged for thousands of gallons of these toxic synthetic chemicals to be shipped directly to our domestic distribution center. She was so proud of her little cost-saving maneuver that she actually sent my mother a text message bragging about how she had just saved the company over $2 million in raw material costs in a single afternoon. My mother naturally praised her to the skies. Susan immediately started calling her friends at the country club, boasting that Megan was a natural-born visionary and was doing a much better job running the company than I ever did. They were all living in a tightly sealed echo chamber of their own arrogance. They truly thought they had outsmarted the entire luxury beauty industry and proved that my 15 years of hard work was nothing more than basic common sense. They were so focused on the money they supposedly saved that they completely ignored the practical reality of cosmetic manufacturing. Buying cheap chemical sludge was only the first step of the process. Having barrels of synthetic ingredients sitting on a loading dock meant absolutely nothing if you did not have the legal right or the technical knowledge to actually mix them together. Having barrels of synthetic ingredients sitting on a loading dock meant absolutely nothing if you did not have the legal right or the technical knowledge to actually mix them together. Furthermore, Megan and Jamal quickly discovered that their cheap synthetic chemicals were completely useless without our proprietary organic binding agents. These highly specialized carrier oils were the secret glue that held all of my formulas together. They were extracted from a specific hybrid of lavender and rose grown exclusively on a private family-owned estate in the south of France. Without these specific European oils, the synthetic ingredients would rapidly separate in the bottles, creating a toxic, smelly sludge. Megan had foolishly planned to quietly mix her new cheap chemicals with my premium French binding agents to stretch the inventory and hide her cost-cutting measures. She just assumed the scheduled shipments from Europe would continue arriving automatically like they always did. But when the warehouse manager logged into the international freight portal to track the massive inbound shipping containers from Provence, he found a glaring red error message. The shipments had been officially halted at the port of Marseille by the exporter. The account status simply read suspended. Panic began to ripple through the corporate office as the production lines ground to a complete and sudden halt. Jamal, seeing an opportunity to assert his dominance and prove his worth as the new chief financial officer, told everyone in the office to calm down. He adjusted his custom-tailored silk tie and confidently marched into the glass-walled conference room. He called Megan in to watch him work his magic. I know exactly how this entire scene played out because my former executive assistant, who remained fiercely loyal to me, was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, taking the official meeting minutes. Jamal loudly declared that I had obviously been too soft on our international vendors. He told Megan that these European farmers just needed a strong, authoritative hand to keep them in line and remind them who was signing their paychecks. Jamal found the contact information for Antoine, the director of the French Organic Cooperative. He dialed the international number and slammed his phone down on the center of the mahogany table, turning the speakerphone volume all the way up so Megan could hear every single word. When Antoine answered the line with a polite, formal greeting, Jamal did not even bother to introduce himself properly. He immediately launched into an aggressive, disrespectful tirade, acting like a mob boss, shaking down a local merchant. Jamal barked into the phone, demanding to know why the shipping containers were being held hostage at the port. He used aggressive corporate buzzwords, trying his absolute best to sound intimidating. He threatened to permanently withhold all future payments. He threatened to cancel every upcoming order and ruin the cooperative's reputation in the global beauty industry. He slammed his fist on the table and demanded that Antoine release the binding agents immediately, or face severe legal consequences and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for breach of contract. I had worked intimately with Antoine for over a decade. He was an elegant, highly educated man who descended from 4 generations of master botanists. He did not tolerate disrespect from anyone, let alone a failed real estate developer playing dress-up in a corporate office. Through the speakerphone, Antoine remained completely and utterly silent, until Jamal finally ran out of breath and stopped yelling. Then, in a calm, icy tone that could have frozen boiling water, Antoine asked exactly who he was speaking to. Jamal puffed out his chest, looked proudly at Megan, and loudly declared that he was the new chief financial officer of Lumiere Botanicals, and that he was the one calling the shots now. Antoine let out a soft, dry chuckle that echoed loudly through the quiet conference room. He politely informed Jamal that he did not care if he was the chief financial officer or the president of the United States. Antoine carefully explained that his agricultural cooperative did not have a contract with Lumiere Botanicals. He stated with absolute clarity that they had never had a contract with Lumiere Botanicals. Jamal frowned, looking at Megan in total confusion. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face. He yelled into the phone that Antoine was a liar. He argued that they had been doing continuous business for 15 years and that the commercial invoices clearly said Lumiere Botanicals at the top of the page. Antoine corrected him with brutal legal precision. He explained that the invoices were indeed paid by the Lumiere Botanicals accounting department as a third-party payment arrangement. However, the actual legally binding contract, the intellectual property agreement, and the exclusive global purchasing rights were held by a completely separate private holding company. He told Jamal that this holding company was owned exclusively and entirely by Claire. Antoine calmly informed Jamal that Claire had officially terminated her licensing agreement with Lumiere Botanicals exactly 48 hours ago. Therefore, the French cooperative had absolutely no legal obligation to ship a single drop of oil to Jamal's warehouse. In fact, Antoine noted doing so would be a direct violation of his exclusive legally binding contract with Claire. Jamal's face turned a dark, violent shade of red. The thick veins in his neck bulged as the terrifying reality of the situation finally began to sink into his thick skull. He realized in real time that he was not an executive negotiating a high-stakes corporate deal. He was a trespasser demanding premium goods he had no legal right to touch. He desperately tried to pivot his strategy. The tough guy act vanished instantly. He practically begged Antoine to reconsider. He offered to pay double the usual market rate. He offered to wire the funds immediately from the corporate account. He tried to bribe Antoine into bypassing my holding company and sending the shipments anyway, promising massive bonuses under the table. Antoine was entirely unimpressed by the frantic display of desperation. He told Jamal that his family cooperative valued loyalty, integrity, and professional respect over quick cash. He stated that Claire was a visionary and a trusted partner, while Jamal was simply an administrative error. Antoine formally requested that Jamal and Lumiere Botanicals cease all contact with his offices immediately. Before Jamal could scream another empty threat, Antoine politely wished him a good day and disconnected the call. The sharp dial tone echoed loudly in the silent conference room. Jamal stared at the phone in absolute stunned silence. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. Megan was sitting across the table with her face completely pale, her hands visibly shaking. The grand illusion of their corporate dominance had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They finally realized the gravity of what my mother had done. She had not handed them the keys to a thriving empire. She had handed them the steering wheel of a car that had no engine, no tires, and no brakes. And they were already rolling rapidly down a very steep hill. They had thousands of gallons of toxic synthetic chemicals sitting on their loading dock that they could not use, and absolutely no way to produce the luxury products they desperately needed to survive. The European suppliers had completely cut them off, and without them, Lumiere Botanicals was nothing but a hollow name printed on a piece of paper. Desperation completely took over. With the European suppliers permanently blocking their access and the quarterly deadlines rapidly approaching, Megan and Jamal made the fatal decision to push forward anyway. They found a discount chemical bottling plant 2 states over that asked absolutely no questions and cared nothing about safety standards. They loaded the cheap synthetic sludge into transport trucks and paid the shady factory exorbitant rush fees to blindly mix and bottle the ingredients. They slapped the prestigious Lumiere Botanicals gold foil labels on the glass bottles and shipped them directly to our top-tier retail partners just in time to meet the seasonal delivery deadlines. Megan genuinely believed she had pulled off a corporate miracle. She actually posted a celebratory video from a luxury rooftop bar holding a glass of champagne, claiming she had single-handedly saved the company from a massive supply chain crisis. She boasted about slashing production costs by 80% and increasing profit margins to unprecedented levels. She had no idea she had just shipped thousands of literal chemical weapons to the faces of our most loyal customers. It took exactly 4 days for the first wave of disaster to hit. Women who had been using my carefully balanced organic serum for years purchased the new batches from luxury beauty counters, expecting the same soothing, radiant results. Instead, the moment the harsh, unrefined chemicals touched their skin, the reactions were immediate and violent. The synthetic preservatives were so caustic that they actually began degrading the rubber droppers inside the bottles, turning the once pristine serum into a toxic, cloudy mess. I was sitting in my home office finalizing the trademark registrations for my new company, Aura Lab, when my phone screen lit up with a notification from a major beauty influencer. This influencer had championed Lumiere Botanicals since my 2nd year in business. I clicked on her video and watched in horror intertwined with a deep sense of grim validation. Her face was covered in angry red welts and severe cystic breakouts. She was holding up the new bottle of serum, crying into the camera and warning her 2 million followers that Lumiere Botanicals had secretly changed their formula and completely ruined her skin. Within 24 hours, the internet was absolutely completely on fire. Thousands of videos flooded every single social media platform. Customers were posting pictures of severe chemical burns, peeling skin, and terrifying allergic reactions requiring emergency dermatologist visits. The hashtag boycott Lumiere became the #1 trending topic globally. TikTok and Instagram were saturated with furious women demanding answers and threatening massive class action lawsuits. Megan tried to handle the public relations nightmare by doing the absolute worst thing possible. She posted a heavily filtered video on the official company page blaming the customers. She claimed they must be using the products incorrectly or suffering from unrelated seasonal allergies. She actually told a woman with second-degree chemical burns that she just needed to let her skin purge the toxins and buy more product to see the true results. The sheer arrogance of her response acted like gasoline poured onto a raging fire. The backlash multiplied tenfold. Internet sleuths began digging into the corporate filings and discovered the recent change in leadership, exposing Megan to the entire world as a spoiled fraud with zero skincare credentials. The luxury retail giants did not waste a single second protecting their own reputations. Corporations like Sephora and Neiman Marcus have zero tolerance for defective products that harm their high-paying clientele. On the morning of the 6th day, Jamal received cold automated emails from the corporate legal departments of every major retailer carrying our brand. They did not just pause future orders, they enacted emergency mandatory product recalls across the entire country. Store employees physically removed every single Lumiere Botanicals box from the shelves and tossed them directly into industrial hazardous waste bins. The retailers formally canceled all active purchase contracts and enacted the severe penalty clauses I had carefully negotiated years ago to ensure total quality control. Because the products were defective and physically harmful, the retailers demanded immediate full refunds for all the inventory they had purchased. They initiated millions of dollars in automated chargebacks directly against the Lumiere Botanicals corporate bank accounts. Jamal was sitting at an exclusive country club, trying to pay for a massive steak lunch with his friends when his corporate credit card was suddenly declined. He pulled out his phone and watched in absolute terror as the company banking app showed the accounts being violently drained in real time. The millions of dollars in liquid cash that they had not already blown on private jets and imported sports cars vanished instantly to cover the retailer refunds. But it was not nearly enough. The chargebacks wildly exceeded the available cash balance, plunging the corporate accounts deep into the negative. The bank immediately froze all their credit lines, flagged the accounts for suspicious activity, and suspended their operating capabilities. My parents, who had been so proudly boasting about Megan's incredible success, suddenly found themselves at the center of a very public scandal. My mother's friends from the country club, who had purchased the new serum based on her glowing recommendations, were now calling her house demanding compensation for their ruined skin and medical bills. Susan tried to call me, leaving frantic voicemails claiming there must be some sort of mistake with the manufacturing plant. She demanded I step in and fix the public relations mess immediately because family protects family. I simply listened to the audio messages while pouring myself a cup of herbal tea, marveling at her staggering delusion. She still thought I was going to swoop in and save them from a burning building they had purposefully set on fire. The $62 million valuation I had spent 15 years carefully constructing evaporated into thin air overnight. A brand is only worth the trust of its consumers, and Megan had completely eradicated that trust in less than 3 months. Lumiere Botanicals was no longer a luxury empire, it was a toxic financial black hole. I watched the stock tickers of our retail partners and read the industry blogs detailing the spectacular collapse. My former employees were quickly abandoning ship, resigning in droves to escape the sinking vessel before their final paychecks bounced. The lavish downtown office that Jamal had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars redecorating was suddenly completely empty, except for him and Megan surrounded by ringing phones they were too terrified to answer. They had finally achieved their ultimate dream of running the company all by themselves, but there was absolutely nothing left to run. By the time the 4th month rolled around, the silence in my penthouse was a stark contrast to the absolute war zone my family had created for themselves. The retailer chargebacks and the frozen bank accounts were only the opening act of their destruction. The real catastrophe arrived in the form of thick stacks of legal documents delivered by relentless process servers. I was busy in my private laboratory reviewing the final packaging designs for Aura Lab when I saw the first major headline on a prominent financial news blog. The situation had officially escalated from angry social media posts to the federal courts. A massive class action lawsuit had been formally filed against Lumiere Botanicals. It was spearheaded by a notoriously aggressive personal injury law firm known for completely dismantling negligent corporations and piercing the corporate veil to hold executives personally responsible. They were representing over 400 women who had suffered severe facial burns, chemical blistering, and permanent scarring from Megan's toxic synthetic serum. The lawsuit was seeking tens of millions of dollars in compensatory and punitive damages. Because Megan had proudly posted that arrogant video, shifting the blame onto the customers, and refusing to issue a proper recall, the lawyers had absolute concrete proof of corporate gross negligence and a total disregard for consumer safety. Process servers began practically living in the lobby of the downtown corporate office. The few remaining administrative staff members who had not already abandoned the sinking ship were terrified to even answer the front doors. They were constantly being handed thick manila envelopes filled with subpoenas, court summons, and demands for immediate legal discovery. The lawyers wanted every internal email, every purchase order, and every document proving Megan and Jamal had knowingly swapped premium organic ingredients for cheap industrial chemicals. When the process servers realized Megan and Jamal were actively hiding in their executive offices with the blinds drawn, they started showing up at their brand new mansion in the suburbs. They ambushed Megan while she was trying to pull her luxury sports car out of the driveway, dropping lawsuits right onto her windshield. They handed documents to Jamal while he was checking his mail. There was nowhere they could hide from the consequences of their own greed. For Jamal, the lawsuits were terrifying, but they were not actually his biggest problem. His true nightmare was entirely financial, and it was completely his own fault. Back in their second month of control, when they were busy remodeling the executive floor and flying first class to St. Bart's, they had quickly realized that my $3 million cash reserve was not going to last forever at their current burn rate. Jamal, wanting to look like a brilliant corporate financier, decided to secure additional capital to fund their lavish lifestyle and the massive order of synthetic chemicals. He had marched into several traditional banks, looking for a massive line of credit. But traditional banks require extensive due diligence. They wanted to see operational histories, projected revenue models, and supply chain audits. Jamal knew he could not provide any of that, so he turned to alternative financing. He sought out predatory high-interest business lenders who handed out millions of dollars with very few questions asked, as long as you could provide hard collateral. Jamal was so intoxicated by his new title and so deeply convinced that Lumiere Botanicals would just automatically generate endless millions that he committed the ultimate financial sin. He signed a personal guarantee. To secure the massive influx of cash, Jamal had pledged his own personal assets as collateral for the corporate loans. He put up the deed to the massive new house he and Megan had just purchased. He leveraged his personal investment accounts and his retirement savings. He legally tied his own financial survival directly to the success of a company he had absolutely no idea how to run. He assumed it was a completely safe bet. He figured the seasonal revenue from our luxury retail partners would easily cover the exorbitant monthly loan payments and leave plenty of profit for him to skim off the top. But now the luxury retailers had entirely abandoned them. The corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by the massive chargebacks and sitting deep in the negative. There was absolutely zero revenue coming in, and there was no prospect of future revenue because the brand reputation was completely destroyed. When the first of the month rolled around, the massive loan payments came due. The predatory lenders did not care about the product recalls or the class action lawsuits. They did not care that Jamal was having a bad week. They just wanted their money. When the automated withdrawals from the Lumiere Botanicals corporate accounts bounced due to insufficient funds, the lenders immediately pivoted and targeted Jamal's personal accounts. They aggressively froze his personal checking and savings accounts. They placed an immediate lien on his brand new mansion. Jamal realized with absolute suffocating horror that he was not just going to lose the company, he was going to lose his house, his cars, and every single dime he had ever claimed to own. The brilliant venture capitalist persona he had been broadcasting all over social media crumbled instantly, leaving behind a terrified, desperate man drowning in a sea of toxic debt. The stress in their household became completely nuclear. My father Richard had personally guaranteed one of the smaller loans to help them secure the new house because he wanted to support Megan's incredible new journey. Now the banks were circling his retirement accounts as well. The perfect little family unit they had so proudly paraded around the conference room the day they fired me was violently fracturing. Megan screamed at Jamal for risking their home. She blamed him for signing the personal guarantees and demanded he fix the situation. Jamal screamed right back at her, blaming her for buying the cheap synthetic chemicals that triggered the lawsuits and destroyed their revenue stream. They spent their days trapped in an empty office, hiding from process servers and fighting viciously over money they no longer had. I watched the legal notices pile up on the public court dockets from the comfort of my penthouse. They were completely paralyzed. They had no money to hire a proper corporate defense attorney to fight the class action lawsuits. They had no money to pay the predatory lenders. They had no money to issue the retailer refunds. Every single decision they had made since sitting in my boardroom had been driven by pure arrogant greed, and now the bill had officially arrived. Jamal knew he had to find a way to liquidate the company assets to pay off his personal debt before the lenders foreclosed on his home and sent him into total bankruptcy. He just needed to figure out exactly how much the company was worth so he could sell it off in pieces and save his own skin. Jamal was completely desperate to find a way out of the massive financial hole he had dug for himself. He knew the predatory lenders were preparing to seize his personal assets and foreclose on his suburban mansion. His only remaining option was to liquidate Lumiere Botanicals. He needed to know exactly how much the company was worth on paper so he could sell off the assets to a larger beauty conglomerate, pay off his massive debts, and walk away clean. Since he had absolutely no idea how to properly read a corporate balance sheet or value a business, he was forced to use the last remaining thousands of dollars in his personal checking account to hire an independent forensic accountant. The accountant was a serious, no-nonsense man who spent 3 full days locked inside my old glass-walled conference room. He requested full access to the corporate servers, the tax returns, the vendor agreements, and the corporate charter. Jamal paced the hallways outside the conference room, acting like an anxious, expectant father. He kept telling Megan that the company was still easily worth $10 to $15 million, even with the recent retail scandal. He genuinely believed that the brand name alone would be enough to save them from bankruptcy. On the afternoon of the third day, the accountant finally emerged from the conference room. He asked Jamal and Megan to sit down at the mahogany table. He did not look impressed. He did not bring out a massive presentation board or offer any words of encouragement. He simply slid a single thin manila folder across the table toward Jamal. Jamal leaned forward, eager for the good news. He asked the accountant for the final valuation number so they could start contacting corporate buyers immediately. The accountant looked at Jamal with a mixture of professional pity and profound disbelief. He flatly stated that the company was worth zero. In fact, when factoring in the massive retail chargebacks and the pending class action lawsuits, the valuation was sitting at negative $8 million. Jamal immediately started yelling. He slammed his hands on the table and accused the accountant of being incompetent. He demanded to know how a company that was generating millions in revenue just 4 months ago could suddenly be completely worthless. He yelled about the product formulas, the manufacturing rights, and the exclusive botanical supply chains. He insisted that the intellectual property alone was worth a fortune to any major cosmetic brand. The accountant calmly opened the folder and pulled out a copy of the corporate structure chart that my attorney David and I had drafted 5 years ago. He turned the paper around so Jamal and Megan could see it clearly. The accountant explained the brutal reality with absolute surgical precision. He told them that Susan did not give them a $62 million empire. She gave them a hollow marketing shell. He pointed to the documents and explained that Lumiere Botanicals only owned the trademarked logo, the leased office space, the computers sitting on the desks, and the massive amount of corporate debt they had rapidly accumulated. He looked Jamal dead in the eye and explicitly stated that they owned absolutely zero intellectual property. Megan started crying, demanding to know who owned the formulas. The accountant tapped his pen against a separate box on the organizational chart. He informed them that every single chemical patent, every manufacturing agreement, and every exclusive supplier contract was legally owned by a completely separate private holding company. He stated that the holding company was owned solely by Claire. He explained that Lumiere Botanicals had only been operating because it was paying a monthly licensing fee to Claire, a fee that had officially expired and been permanently terminated 2 months ago. The devastating realization finally hit Jamal like a freight train. The color completely drained from his face. All the arrogant posturing, all the social media bragging, and all the aggressive phone calls to my suppliers flashed before his eyes. He realized in that exact moment that he had never been the boss. He had never been a brilliant venture capitalist. He had simply been a trespasser sitting in a chair that I allowed him to borrow until I decided to pull it out from under him. He realized that my mother had blindly handed them a loaded weapon, and they had immediately pointed it at their own feet and pulled the trigger. Later that same afternoon, I was sitting in my pristine new office at Aura Lab. The space was bright and filled with the soothing scent of my new organic formulations. My business phone, which I kept entirely separate from my personal life, suddenly lit up on my desk. The caller identification showed a blocked number, but I knew exactly who it was. I did not answer. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, the audio file arrived in my inbox. I leaned back in my chair, clicked play, and put the phone on speaker. It was Jamal. The audience of my life was about to hear the exact moment a deeply arrogant man broke down completely. The voicemail started off aggressively. Jamal was still trying to cling to his tough guy persona. His voice was loud and demanding. He ordered me to pick up the phone immediately. He tried to threaten me, claiming that he was going to hire a team of ruthless lawyers to pierce the corporate veil and seize my holding company. He called me a fraud and accused me of setting a malicious legal trap for my own flesh and blood. But as the voicemail continued, the facade began to rapidly crumble. The aggressive shouting turned into heavy, panicked breathing. He stopped threatening me and started rambling. He admitted that he had just spoken to the forensic accountant. His voice cracked as he repeated the exact words the accountant had told him. He said out loud that they owned nothing. The reality of his personal financial ruin began pouring out of him through the phone speaker. He confessed that he had personally guaranteed the massive business loans to buy the synthetic chemicals. He admitted that the predatory lenders had already frozen his personal bank accounts and were initiating foreclosure proceedings on the new house. He sounded completely terrified. He told me that Megan was having a nervous breakdown in the next room, and that my father was threatening to disown him for ruining the family retirement funds. Then came the begging. The man who had sat in my boardroom with a smug, arrogant smirk, the man who had told me to step aside so he could secure his family. Legacy began openly sobbing on the voicemail. He pleaded with me to call the retail partners and fix the lawsuits. He begged me to reinstate the licensing agreement so they could start producing the real serum again. He promised to give me my chief executive officer title back if I would just bail him out of the millions of dollars in debt he had created. He realized that I had legally outsmarted all of them without ever lifting a single finger. I had simply walked away and let their own breathtaking incompetence destroy them. I sat in my beautiful new office listening to him cry. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the sudden urge to be the bigger person and rescue them from their own consequences. For 15 years, my family had treated me like a machine that existed solely to generate wealth for them to spend. When they thought they had the upper hand, they tossed me aside without a second of hesitation. Now that they were drowning in the ocean they expected me to throw them a life raft. I reached forward and pressed the delete button on the voicemail. I permanently erased the sound of his panic from my phone. I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the office to grab dinner with my new lead chemist. My family had demanded complete control of the business, and I had given it to them. What they chose to do with it was no longer my problem. In the days following Jamal's pathetic breakdown, my personal cell phone remained completely silent. I had blocked their numbers months ago, and I had absolutely no intention of ever unblocking them. But my secondary business line, the one I had unfortunately left active to handle the final legal transitions with my suppliers, became a digital graveyard of my family's escalating panic. I did not answer a single call. I simply let the automated system collect their messages while I went about my daily life. It started with my mother. I would sit in my sunlit kitchen sipping a cup of matcha and listen to Susan's voice echoing from the speaker of my phone. At first, she was still trying to cling to her authority. She sounded exactly like she did sitting in that glass-walled conference room, arrogant and demanding. She ordered me to call Jamal immediately. She told me I needed to stop throwing a tantrum and instantly transfer the intellectual property patents over to Lumiere Botanicals. She claimed I was being completely unreasonable and dragging out a simple misunderstanding for no reason. 2 hours later, my father Richard left a message. His tone was firm, treating me like a disobedient teenager who had broken curfew. He told me to stop playing games, stating that the company was a family asset, and I was legally obligated to cooperate. They still thought they were in charge. They still genuinely believed I would eventually fold under their pressure. But by the end of the week, the tone shifted drastically. The predatory lenders had officially moved in on my father's assets. Because Richard had proudly co-signed the massive high-interest business loan to help Jamal buy those cheap synthetic chemicals, the bank had frozen his and Susan's joint checking accounts. They also placed a heavy lien on my parents' retirement portfolio, effectively blocking them from accessing the money they had saved their entire lives. The voicemails turned vicious. My father yelled so loudly into the receiver that the audio heavily distorted. He called me an ungrateful monster. He accused me of deliberately orchestrating the complete financial ruin of our family name. He screamed that the bank was threatening his country club membership and that Susan was having severe heart palpitations from the stress. My mother left a separate message later that evening, sobbing with pure rage. She cursed the day I was born and blamed me entirely for Megan's miserable state of affairs. She accused me of setting a malicious trap, refusing to take an ounce of responsibility for the fact that she was the one who forced me out of my own company. Then came the final phase, absolute soul-crushing terror. This happened right after the massive class action lawsuit was publicly filed and the luxury retailers formalized their millions of dollars in automated chargebacks. The stark realization that they were going to lose their comfortable suburban lifestyle forever finally broke their arrogant spirits. Richard left a voicemail at 2 in the morning. His voice was trembling and weak. He was practically whispering, telling me that the lawyers were threatening to seize their primary residence to satisfy the outstanding debt. He begged me to step in and buy the Lumiere Botanicals brand back from them. He pleaded with me to just give them $1 million to settle the most urgent loans and stop the foreclosure proceedings. Susan got on the phone crying actual genuine tears of fear, saying they would have to file for bankruptcy at their age. She begged me to remember the good times, completely ignoring the fact that she had gleefully stolen my entire life work just 4 months prior. I listened to their desperation and felt absolutely nothing but closure. I did not text them back. I did not forward the messages to my attorney. I just tapped the screen and hit delete, permanently erasing their voices from my device. I had far more important things to do than listen to ghosts complaining about a fire they intentionally started. While my family was drowning in legal notices and foreclosure warnings, I was busy cutting the ribbon on my brand new future. That exact same week was the official digital launch of Aura Lab. I had spent the last several months perfectly executing my strategy in total silence. I secured a state-of-the-art laboratory downtown, finalized my sleek minimalist packaging, and re-established my ironclad supply chain with my French and Italian organic farmers. The transition was utterly seamless. The moment the beauty world realized that Claire, the original founder and formulator of Lumiere Botanicals, was launching a new ultra-premium wellness line, the response was astronomical. My fiercely loyal clients did not hesitate for a second. The top-tier dermatologists who had publicly condemned Megan's toxic chemical batches immediately threw their full support behind Aura Lab. They knew I owned the original patents and that my new formulas were even more refined and effective than before. On launch day, I sat in my new beautiful executive office surrounded by my dedicated team. Many of them were former Lumiere employees who had quit the moment Megan took over and rushed to work for me as soon as I opened my doors. We gathered around the large monitors to watch the live sales dashboard. Within the first 2 hours of the website going live, we completely sold out of our flagship botanical serum. The revenue numbers climbed so fast that our payment processing servers nearly crashed from the heavy traffic. The luxury retail giants, the exact same corporations who had just dropped Lumiere Botanicals into the hazardous waste bin, reached out to me directly. The executive buyers from Sephora and Neiman Marcus sent massive floral arrangements to my new office. They offered me incredibly lucrative, exclusive shelf space, desperate to get my authentic products back into their stores before the holiday shopping season began. I walked through the pristine, bustling halls of the Aura Lab headquarters, feeling a profound sense of pride. My employees were smiling, energized, and properly compensated. I was surrounded by a team of brilliant professionals who respected my leadership, not a family of parasites looking for a free ride. I had rebuilt my empire from the ground up in record time entirely on my own terms. I had absolute control over every single patent, every supplier contract, and every dollar that flowed through the business. As the late afternoon sun poured into my office, I looked out at the sprawling Chicago skyline. I knew my parents, my sister, and Jamal were sitting in a dark, empty house, absolutely terrified of the process servers knocking at their front door. They had traded my lifelong loyalty for a few months of fake luxury, and now they were paying the ultimate, unchangeable price. I picked up a bottle of my new Aura Lab serum, admiring the heavy glass and the elegant branding. I realized in that quiet moment that stepping out of my family's shadow was not just a necessary escape. It was the most profitable and empowering decision I had ever made. I was finally completely free, and my new life was just beginning. 5 months exactly. 150 days had passed since I walked out of that glass-walled conference room and left my family sitting at the mahogany table. Tonight, I was standing on a brightly lit stage in the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. I was the keynote speaker for the annual Global Botanical Beauty Innovation Summit. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glow over a sea of industry executives, elite dermatologists, and international investors. I wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that draped perfectly to the floor. As I concluded my speech about the wildly successful launch of Aura Lab and the vital importance of supply chain integrity, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. I smiled, looking out at the crowd. I did not just survive the hostile takeover of my own life. I had completely reinvented my empire and ascended to an entirely new level of success. The applause washed over me, a loud, validating roar that drowned out every single echo of doubt my parents had ever tried to plant in my mind. I gracefully exited the stage, shaking hands with prominent beauty magazine editors and accepting congratulations from top-tier retail buyers. My public relations team immediately escorted me away from the flashing cameras and guided me down a quiet, carpeted hallway toward the private VIP lounge. The lounge was a sanctuary of calm. The room featured plush velvet seating, dim ambient lighting, and a private bartender pouring top-shelf champagne. I asked my team to give me a few minutes of total privacy to decompress after the massive presentation. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the luxurious space. I kicked off my designer heels, sank into a velvet armchair, and picked up a crystal glass of sparkling water. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, cleansing breath. That peaceful silence lasted for exactly 3 minutes. Suddenly, I heard a loud commotion echoing from the hallway outside. The muffled sounds of an argument quickly escalated into outright shouting. I heard the stern voice of the event security detail demanding to see credential badges, followed immediately by a sharp, frantic voice that I would recognize anywhere. It was my mother, Susan. The heavy oak door of the VIP lounge was suddenly violently pushed open, bouncing off the wall with a loud thud. Two large security guards in black suits stepped into the doorway, physically attempting to hold back four people who were desperately trying to push their way inside. I placed my crystal glass down on the side table and slowly stood up. I looked at the chaotic scene unfolding in the doorway of my private sanctuary. It was Susan, Richard, Megan, and Jamal. The head of security looked at me with an apologetic expression. He explained that these individuals had sneaked past the main lobby barricades and claimed it was an absolute family emergency. He asked if I wanted him to call the local police and have them formally escorted off the premises for trespassing. I stared at the four people struggling against the security guards. The sheer visual contrast between this moment and our last face-to-face meeting in the boardroom was absolutely staggering. They did not look like the smug, arrogant corporate titans who had stolen my $62 million company. They looked like refugees from a financial war zone. I raised my hand and calmly signaled to the security guards. I told them it was fine and instructed them to wait directly outside the door. I wanted to hear exactly what they had to say. The guards reluctantly stepped back, releasing their grip and pulling the heavy oak door shut behind them, trapping the five of us inside the quiet room. I stood barefoot on the plush carpet, crossing my arms and taking a long, silent inventory of my family. The physical toll of the last 5 months was written all over their bodies. When my mother slid those transfer papers across the table, she was wearing a pristine designer suit and a string of flawless pearls. Today she was wearing a wrinkled off-the-rack blouse that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry basket. Her hair, usually styled to perfection at an expensive salon, was flat and graying at the roots. The arrogant light in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a hollow, exhausted panic. My father, Richard, had aged 10 years in 5 months. His posture was completely hunched. The proud, authoritative man who had patted my shoulder and ordered me to step down gracefully was now nervously wringing his hands together. He was wearing a cheap, faded golf shirt, and his face was deeply lined with stress. I knew the bank had frozen his retirement accounts, and the reality of facing his senior years with absolutely zero financial security had clearly broken his spirit. But the most dramatic transformations belonged to Megan and Jamal. Megan, the beloved golden child who used to spend her days posting glamorous photos from private jets and luxury boutiques, looked completely unrecognizable. She was shockingly thin, her face pale and drawn. She was wearing cheap dark leggings and a faded oversized sweater. She was clutching a worn-out canvas tote bag instead of the limited edition designer handbag she had purchased with my corporate funds. Her manicured nails were chipped and bitten down to the quick. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent the last 2 months hiding indoors from angry process servers and aggressive debt collectors. Jamal stood slightly behind her, a hollow shell of the man who had confidently declared himself a venture capitalist. His custom-tailored silk suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting jacket and a pair of scuffed dress shoes. He was sweating profusely, and his hands were physically trembling. This was the man who had barked orders at my French suppliers and arrogantly co-signed millions of dollars in predatory loans. Now he looked like a terrified child, waiting to be scolded. The crushing weight of the class action lawsuits, the retailer chargebacks, and the impending foreclosure on his mansion had entirely crushed his massive ego. They stood awkwardly near the entrance of the VIP lounge, looking around at the luxurious surroundings. The room smelled of expensive flowers and high-end catering, a stark reminder of the world they had forcefully ejected themselves from. They looked at my custom emerald gown, my perfectly styled hair, and the undeniable aura of success radiating from every corner of the room. They had come here expecting to find the obedient daughter and sister they had manipulated for 15 years. Instead, they were standing face to face with the founder of a brand new, highly profitable empire. For the first 3 decades of my life, seeing my family in this kind of severe distress would have triggered an immediate panic response within me. I would have instantly reached for my checkbook. I would have called my lawyers to fix their mistakes. I had been heavily conditioned since childhood to act as their personal shock absorber, absorbing the impact of their terrible decisions so they could continue living comfortably. But looking at them now, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of clinical curiosity. I watched them the way a scientist observes an experiment that has finally reached its inevitable conclusion. They had desperately wanted to be in the driver's seat. They had demanded the keys to the vehicle. They had aggressively kicked me to the curb and sped off down the highway. Now that they had crashed the car into a brick wall and set it completely on fire, they had miraculously tracked me down just to demand that I put out the flames. I glanced over at the private bar where a bottle of vintage champagne was resting in a silver ice bucket. I walked over to the bucket, taking my time. I pulled a fresh crystal flute from the rack and slowly poured myself a glass. The crisp sound of the carbonation fizzing in the quiet room seemed to make Jamal flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my mother. I told them they had exactly 3 minutes before the security guards came back inside to forcefully remove them from the premises. I suggested they use their time very wisely. The absolute finality in my voice seemed to shock them even more than my appearance. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the executioner, and the trial was about to begin. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint muffled bass of the gala music playing in the ballroom down the hall. I stood perfectly still, holding my champagne flute, waiting for the inevitable apology. I assumed that after 5 months of catastrophic failure and total financial ruin, they had finally hit rock bottom. I thought they had come here to throw themselves at my mercy and admit how terribly they had treated me. I was completely wrong. My mother, Susan, did not lower her head in shame. She did not express a single ounce of regret for forcing me out of the company I built. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She took a step forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, and shattered the silence. She screamed that I had set them up. Her voice echoed sharply off the velvet walls as she accused me of planning this from the very beginning. She yelled that I deliberately hid those patents in a secret holding company just to watch my own sister fail. She claimed I knew they did not have the manufacturing rights and that I walked out of that boardroom anyway, just to humiliate them on a global scale. I actually let out a short, incredulous laugh. The sheer audacity of her accusation was absolutely breathtaking. She had marched into my office, demanded I surrender 15 years of my blood, sweat, and tears, and then handed my empire over to her favorite child. And yet somehow in her deeply twisted narcissistic mind, I was still the villain of the story. I looked at her and replied with a completely calm and level voice. I told her that I did not hide anything. I explained that she just never bothered to read the corporate documents she claimed to own. I reminded her that she never asked a single question about the supply chain or the intellectual property because she was too busy popping champagne and celebrating her hostile takeover. Megan stepped out from behind our mother, wiping tears from her hollow cheeks. She looked at me with a pathetic mixture of anger and desperation. She started crying and blamed me for her own incompetence. She told me I knew she did not know how to run the manufacturing side. She said I knew she did not understand those complex European vendor contracts. According to her twisted logic, I should have stayed and trained her. She actually said I should have guided her through the transition instead of just abandoning her. She accused me of purposely letting her buy those cheap synthetic ingredients to make her look like a fool in front of the entire world. She sobbed that her reputation was completely ruined and that she had millions of people on the internet sending her death threats and calling her a fraud. She complained that the luxury lifestyle she was meant to have was stolen from her. She acted as if she were the victim of a natural disaster rather than the architect of her own downfall. I took another slow sip of my champagne. I looked at my sister and told her that she was a fraud. I told her I did not force her to buy industrial waste and slap a luxury label on it. I reminded her that she did that all by herself because she wanted to increase her profit margins to buy another imported sports car. I told her she poisoned her own customers and that I simply stepped out of her way and let her run the business exactly like she demanded. At that moment, Jamal pushed past his wife. He was practically vibrating with panic. He did not care about the customers or the ruined reputation. He only cared about his own impending loss of freedom. He stepped dangerously close to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He demanded that I listen to him, his voice cracking with utter desperation. He told me this was not a game anymore. He confessed that the banks were not just foreclosing on the house. The situation had escalated far beyond missed mortgage payments. The predatory lenders he used to buy those synthetic chemicals were threatening to go to the federal authorities. He admitted that when he applied for those massive business loans, he swore under oath that Lumiere Botanicals owned the proprietary formulas. He used my intellectual property as collateral. Since they did not actually own those patents, the banks were officially accusing him of committing massive federal wire fraud and bank fraud. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead, his breathing heavy and erratic. He told me the lawyers said he was facing serious federal prison time. He demanded that I contact my lawyer tonight. He ordered me to sign those patents over to him immediately. He told me I had to draft a retroactive licensing agreement, proving that Lumiere Botanicals had full access to the intellectual property the entire time. He tried to use guilt, claiming that if I did not give him those patents, he was going to be arrested, and my sister was going to be raising her 3 kids alone while her husband rotted in a jail cell. I stared at him completely unmoved by his terror. I told him that he committed federal fraud. I reminded him that he lied on legal loan applications to fund a lifestyle he did not earn. I stated clearly that his criminal problem with the federal government had absolutely nothing to do with me or my holding company. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was not going to commit perjury and falsify legal documents to save him from the consequences of his own arrogant greed. My refusal sent a shockwave of panic through the room. My father, Richard, who had been standing silently near the door, suddenly snapped. The quiet, defeated old man vanished, replaced by the authoritative bully who had spent my entire childhood demanding my total submission. He stormed across the room, his face flushed dark red with anger. He closed the distance between us and lunged forward aggressively, grabbing my bare upper arm with his rough hand. His grip was tight and painful, pulling me forward as he tried to physically assert his dominance. He barked at me to stop acting like a spoiled brat and fix this mess right now. His grip tightened on my arm as he ordered me to call my lawyer and transfer those patents to my sister. He tried to lecture me about family, claiming that family is supposed to protect each other. He seemed entirely blind to the hypocrisy of his words. He had never once protected me from my mother's cruelty or my sister's greed. But now that their bank accounts were empty, suddenly the rules of family loyalty strictly applied to me. He screamed that they were on the verge of losing everything. He yelled that he and Susan were going to lose their retirement, that Megan was going to lose her home, and that Jamal was going to prison. He pointed out that I had millions of dollars and a brand new company, so I had more than enough. He demanded that I do the right thing and save them. The physical contact was the final straw. For 35 years, I had allowed this man to dictate my worth. I had allowed him to make me feel small, insignificant, and obligated to serve people who openly despised me. But the woman standing in this VIP lounge was not the frightened little girl who used to seek his approval. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up directly into his eyes. My expression was so cold and unyielding that I actually saw a flicker of hesitation cross his angry face. I did not yell. I did not scream for security. I just yanked my arm back with such sudden, forceful authority that he physically stumbled backward. I warned him in a low, dangerous register to never put his hands on me again. Richard stood there rubbing his empty hand, looking genuinely shocked that I had physically defied him. The absolute audacity of their demands hung heavily in the air. They had marched into my private event, hijacked my celebration, and demanded that I commit federal crimes to bail them out of bankruptcy and prison. They still fundamentally believed that my sole purpose on this earth was to be their personal safety net. They thought that because we shared the same blood, I was legally and morally obligated to let them drain my life dry. I set my champagne glass down on the table. The 3 minutes were almost up. It was time to give them the reality check they had been desperately avoiding for the last 5 months. It was time to break down the exact mathematics of their spectacular failure and show them that the only people responsible for this massive burning wreckage were the four individuals standing inside this room. As I stepped forward, the heavy oak door of the VIP lounge slowly opened a few inches. The head of security had cracked it to check on the situation. Standing right behind him in the brightly lit hallway were several prominent beauty industry journalists and rival corporate executives who had gathered after hearing the initial commotion. I did not ask the guards to shut the door. I wanted every single person standing out there to hear the absolute truth. I wanted the entire industry to know exactly why Lumiere Botanicals collapsed, so no one could ever blame my formulations for the disaster my family created. I turned my attention directly to my mother. She was still glaring at me, but her eyes darted nervously toward the open door as she realized we had an audience. "Mom, you gave away a company without knowing what made it valuable," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "You assumed my 15 years of sweat and intellect could be handed to a woman whose greatest achievement was marrying a fraud. I did not set you up. I just stopped doing the work for you." My mother opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off instantly. I was not finished. I looked at Megan and Jamal and began to systematically break down the exact mathematics of their spectacular failure. I told them that when they walked into that boardroom and aggressively demanded my resignation, they inherited a pristine balance sheet. I handed them a company with zero debt, an elite global reputation, and a $3 million liquid cash reserve. I explained that any competent executive would have used that money to secure the international supply chain and maintain the quarterly production schedules. "Instead, you treated the corporate accounts like a personal lottery jackpot," I said, staring directly at Megan. "You drained the operating budget to charter private jets to St. Bart's. You bought a luxury sports car and diamond necklaces while the warehouse shelves sat completely empty. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars remodeling an office you barely even worked in. You assumed the business was a magical machine that would just automatically print money forever without requiring any actual intelligence or effort on your part." Megan stared at the floor, her face flushed with deep humiliation as the journalist whispered in the hallway. Then I turned to Jamal. He was visibly shaking, gripping the back of a velvet chair to keep himself upright. I dismantled his entire argument about the patents and the federal fraud charges piece by piece. "When you realized you had blown through the cash reserves and could not afford the premium organic ingredients, you decided to play scientist," I told him. "You bypassed my holding company to save a few pennies and bought industrial chemical waste. You thought the consumers were stupid. You thought women who spent hundreds of dollars on premium skincare would not notice that you had replaced high-grade botanical extracts with toxic petroleum fillers. You shipped literal chemical weapons to luxury retail stores and permanently scarred hundreds of innocent women. You destroyed a $62 million brand valuation in less than 100 days just to maintain a fake billionaire lifestyle on social media." Jamal tried to interrupt, pleading about the federal bank loans, but I raised my hand and silenced him. "You are terrified of federal prison because you committed wire fraud." I continued, my tone completely uncompromising. "You marched into those predatory lending offices and signed your name on legal documents, swearing you owned the intellectual property. You used those patents as collateral. You did not bother to hire a forensic accountant before taking over the company because your massive ego convinced you that you knew everything. You never read the vendor agreements. You never read the corporate charter. You lied to the federal government because you were too lazy to read the fine print of the company you stole. That is not a trap I set for you. That is a crime you committed entirely on your own." I turned to my father. Richard stood there rubbing his arm, looking utterly defeated and humiliated as the industry elites watched from the hallway. He could not even look me in the eye. I reminded him of the day in the conference room. I reminded him that he was the one who told me to stop being selfish. He was the one who told me to step down and gracefully hand over my life work to secure his favorite daughter's future. "I did exactly what you asked me to do," I told my father. "I gave you complete control. I gave you the title, the office, and the bank accounts. The fact that you all immediately drove the company off a massive financial cliff is a direct result of the incompetence you have coddled and enabled for 30 years. You spent your entire life praising Megan for doing absolutely nothing while demanding that I carry the weight of this family. You co-signed those predatory loans because you wanted to play the role of the supportive patriarch. Now the bank is taking your retirement funds, and you want me to write a check to fix your terrible parenting. The silence in the room was absolute. The sheer weight of the truth pressed down on them, completely crushing whatever delusional entitlement they had carried into the hotel. They had spent the last 5 months blaming me for their failures, convincing themselves that I was a malicious mastermind who had tricked them into bankruptcy. But stripped of all the excuses and laid bare in front of industry professionals, they could no longer deny the reality. They bankrupted themselves through pure, unadulterated greed and profound stupidity. Jamal fell to his knees on the plush carpet. The man who had once smirked at me across a mahogany table was now openly weeping, begging me to show mercy. He begged me to just sign a retroactive licensing agreement. He promised they would give me the company back. He promised he would walk away and never bother me again if I would just save him from a federal indictment. I looked down at him and delivered my final decision. I am not signing over a single patent, I said, my voice ringing with total finality. I am not writing a check to pay off your high-interest loans. I am not going to commit perjury and lie to federal investigators to save you from the consequences of your own criminal negligence. Lumiere Botanicals is completely toxic. The brand is dead, and it is worth absolutely nothing to me now. I told them that they had demanded my empire and I had given it to them. What they chose to do with it was their own burden to bear. I instructed them to leave the VIP lounge immediately and go home to deal with their lawyers. I turned to the head of security, who was standing in the doorway, watching the entire scene with wide eyes. I politely asked him to escort these 4 individuals out of the building. The security guard stepped into the room and took my parents by the arms, gently but firmly guiding them toward the exit. Jamal tried to resist reaching out toward me as the guards pulled him to his feet, but Megan simply grabbed his arm and pulled him away. She looked completely broken. I watched them walk out into the hallway, running a gauntlet of staring journalists and whispering executives. They looked incredibly small and pathetic as they were marched out of the luxury hotel and back into the nightmare they had created for themselves. I stood in the quiet VIP lounge, alone once again, surrounded by the elegant atmosphere of my new success. I picked up my crystal flute of champagne and took a long, slow sip, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. The heavy chains of family obligation that had dragged me down for 35 years were finally permanently shattered. As the security guards guided my family down the long carpeted hallway toward the exit, something inside Jamal completely snapped. The impending reality of federal prison and the absolute loss of his wealth finally shattered whatever fragile illusion of marital loyalty he still possessed. He was halfway down the corridor, surrounded by whispering journalists and staring executives, when he suddenly planted his feet. He violently jerked his arm out of the security guard's grip. Before anyone could react, he turned around and sprinted back toward the open door of the VIP lounge where I was still standing. Megan screamed his name from down the hall, her voice echoing with shock and confusion, but Jamal completely ignored her. He shoved his way back into the doorway, breathing heavily, his eyes wild and darting around the room. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife, who was being held back by a guard. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing Megan entirely under the bus in front of the entire industry press. He yelled that she had ruined his life. He screamed that he never wanted to take over the company and that it was all her greedy idea. He told the crowd that Megan was a delusional narcissist who cared more about buying designer handbags than running a functional business. He publicly humiliated her, exposing every single intimate detail of their financial ruin. He shouted that she had forced him to co-sign those predatory loans because she refused to downgrade her luxury lifestyle when the European suppliers cut them off. Megan stood frozen in the hallway. The golden child who had spent her entire life being protected and praised by our parents was now being viciously ripped apart by the man she had married. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the journalists frantically took notes and recorded the entire meltdown on their phones. My parents looked on in absolute horror, entirely powerless to stop the public destruction of their perfect family image. Jamal turned his back on his crying wife and looked desperately at me. He dropped his aggressive posture and clasped his hands together in a pathetic, pleading gesture. He begged me to buy the Lumiere Botanical Shell Company back from him. He promised to sell it to me for absolute pennies on the dollar. He did not want millions anymore. He was practically hyperventilating, offering to sign over the entire corporate entity for $50,000. Then he dropped the price to $10,000. He told me I could have the logo, the office furniture, the customer mailing lists, and the entire brand history. He explained his desperate logic with frantic speed. He believed that if I bought the company back and officially took over as the chief executive officer, I would inherit the corporate debt and the pending lawsuits. More importantly, he believed a formal buyout would get his name off the legal documents and somehow shield him from the federal wire fraud investigation. He was begging me to become his financial meat shield. He asked me to write a tiny check to save the father of my nieces and nephews from spending the next decade in a federal penitentiary. I stood there holding my crystal glass, and I let out a cold, sharp laugh. It was not a laugh of joy or triumph. It was a laugh of profound disbelief at his absolute lack of basic business intelligence. Even after bankrupting a $62 million empire, he still fundamentally did not understand how the corporate world actually worked. I stepped closer to the doorway, looking down at him with absolute contempt. I asked him why in the world I would ever buy a burning building when I had just finished building a fireproof castle right across the street. I explained to him using small, simple words so his panicked brain could comprehend the reality of his situation. I told him that the Lumiere Botanicals brand was completely radioactive. It was no longer associated with luxury or organic healing. Thanks to his and Megan's brilliant leadership, the name Lumiere was now globally synonymous with severe chemical burns, consumer fraud, and massive class action lawsuits. The logo he was trying to sell me was completely worthless. The customer mailing lists were useless because every single person on that list actively hated the company. I told him that Aura Lab was already projected to surpass Lumiere's peak revenue by the end of the fiscal year. My new brand was completely untainted by their gross negligence. I had the patents, I had the suppliers, and I had the trust of the global market. I looked him dead in the eye and stated clearly that taking ownership of Lumiere Botanicals, even for a single dollar, would instantly infect my new empire with their toxic liabilities. "I am not giving you a single dime, Jamal," I said, my voice carrying clearly into the hallway. "I am not buying your debt. I am not buying your lawsuits. And I am certainly not buying the empty shell of a company that you and my sister murdered. You wanted to be the boss. You wanted to be the venture capitalist calling the shots. Now you get to deal with the federal prosecutors all by yourself." Jamal stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as the final shred of his hope completely evaporated. He reached out a trembling hand toward me, but the security guards had finally caught up. Two large men in black suits grabbed him by the shoulders and forcefully pulled him away from the doorway. He did not even try to fight them this time. His legs seemed to give out beneath him, and the guards practically had to drag him down the hallway. Megan did not rush to his side. She turned and walked away toward the lobby exits. Her head hung low, completely broken by the public betrayal. My parents followed closely behind her, their faces pale and etched with the devastating reality that their lives were completely over. I watched the heavy oak door of the VIP lounge swing shut, finally blocking them from my sight for the rest of my life. The room was quiet once again. I took a deep breath, turned my back to the door, and walked over to pour myself another glass of champagne. The morning after the gala, the financial news outlets officially confirmed the end of the line. Lumiere Botanicals formally filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. It was not a Chapter 11 restructuring designed to save the business. It was a complete and total liquidation. The federal courts appointed a trustee who immediately marched into the downtown executive suite and changed all the locks. The expensive marble desks, the velvet couches, and the custom artwork Jamal had purchased with my emergency cash reserves were unceremoniously auctioned off to the highest bidder to help cover a tiny fraction of the retailer chargebacks. In a matter of days, the $62 million empire they had stolen from me was legally dissolved into a pile of worthless paperwork. Without my holding company to serve as a protective financial shield, the predatory lenders executed their final move. The foreclosure on Jamal's massive suburban mansion was swift, brutal, and entirely public. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the eviction happened on a bright Tuesday morning while all the wealthy neighbors watched from their pristine front lawns. Heavy moving trucks blocked the street. Megan, who just months ago was bragging about her imported sports cars and private jets, had to pack her belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and black plastic garbage bags. The luxury vehicles were repossessed by tow trucks right out of the driveway while she stood on the curb crying. Having absolutely zero money and nowhere else to go, Megan, Jamal, and their 3 children were forced to move directly into my parents' unfinished basement. The glamorous self-proclaimed skincare visionary and her arrogant venture capitalist husband were now sleeping on a damp futon surrounded by holiday decorations and old furniture. Their carefully curated social media presence vanished instantly. They were forced to permanently delete all their accounts because they could no longer handle the thousands of angry comments from scarred customers and the sheer public humiliation of their fake wealth being exposed to the entire world. But the absolute harshest reality fell squarely on the shoulders of my parents. Susan and Richard had spent their entire adult lives cultivating a flawless upper crust image. They looked down on everyone else and prized their perfect family aesthetic above basic human decency. That pristine image was violently and completely obliterated. Because Richard had proudly co-signed those high-interest business loans to help Jamal buy the cheap synthetic chemicals, the aggressive personal injury lawyers easily pierced the corporate veil. The women who had suffered severe facial burns demanded justice, and the legal system agreed that my parents' personal assets were fair game. To settle the massive class action lawsuits and to miraculously keep Jamal from being indicted on federal wire fraud charges, my parents had to make a devastating sacrifice. They were forced to completely liquidate their entire retirement portfolio. Every single dollar they had saved for the last 40 years was violently drained to pay off the victim settlements and the exorbitant legal defense fees. The comfortable, wealthy retirement they had constantly bragged about, the luxury cruises and the endless golf trips, vanished overnight. Richard, who had always prided himself on his authoritative financial acumen, was forced to come out of retirement. At nearly 70 years old, he had to take a miserable entry-level administrative job at a local logistics company just to keep the lights on and feed the extra 5 mouths currently living in his house. The immense stress and humiliation aged him terribly. Susan stopped leaving the house altogether. She was too deeply ashamed to even show her face at the local grocery store, where everyone knew exactly what her family had done. The social fallout was exactly what they deserved. The prestigious country club where my mother spent her afternoons gossiping and drinking expensive wine quietly revoked their membership. The board of directors sent a formal letter citing the massive public scandal and my parents' sudden inability to pay the heavy monthly dues. The wealthy friends who used to attend their lavish dinner parties suddenly stopped returning their phone calls. The women whose skin had been ruined by Megan's toxic serum made sure that my mother was permanently blacklisted from every social circle in the neighborhood. They became the ultimate cautionary tale in their exclusive suburban bubble, completely isolated and shunned by the people they wanted so desperately to impress. My mother, who used to post endless updates praising her golden child, was now permanently trapped in a cramped house filled with screaming grandchildren, a bitter daughter, and a deeply resentful son-in-law. The toxic family dynamic they had nurtured for decades was finally locked inside a single house with absolutely no escape hatch. Without my money to cushion their lives, they turned entirely on each other. I heard they spent their days screaming, constantly fighting over grocery bills and the massive mountain of debt they all shared. Jamal blamed Megan for ruining his life. Megan blamed my parents for not protecting her. and my parents blamed Jamal for losing their retirement. I had completely removed myself from the equation, leaving the parasites to slowly consume each other. 6 months after the complete bankruptcy of Lumiere Botanicals, I found myself standing on the sprawling stone balcony of my brand new European headquarters. The crisp evening air of Paris brushed against my face. Below me, the glowing lights of the city reflected beautifully off the dark waters of the River Seine, and the iconic Eiffel Tower sparkled in the distance. I held a cup of artisan tea, resting my hands on the cold stone railing, and took a deep breath of absolute freedom. The contrast between my current reality and the suffocating environment I had escaped was almost difficult to comprehend. Oralab had not just survived the turbulent corporate transition, it had completely exploded into a massive global phenomenon. Within our first year of operation, our corporate valuation completely shattered the numbers I had previously achieved. We were officially valued at over $120 million. Our flagship stores were opening in London, Tokyo, and right here in Paris. My dedicated team of chemists and marketing directors were thriving under a leadership model built on mutual respect and actual hard work. I had managed to rebuild my empire bigger and stronger than ever before, simply because I no longer had the massive dead weight of my family dragging down my profit margins and my mental health. I had officially secured the absolute highest tier of European organic certifications. My French suppliers, the very same men who had laughed at Jamal on the phone and cut him off completely, were now my exclusive business partners. We frequently had dinner together in the French countryside, toasting to our continued mutual success. They respected me as a peer, and I respected them as the backbone of my incredible products. I was surrounded by a chosen family of professionals who valued integrity and dedication. As I looked out over the incredible Parisian skyline, I spent a few quiet moments reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last year and a half. When people hear my story, they often congratulate me on executing such a brilliant and flawless revenge. They think I am some sort of cold, calculating mastermind who spent months actively plotting the total financial destruction of my parents and my sister. But the absolute truth is far simpler and much more profound. True revenge is not about screaming or fighting. It is not about hiring aggressive lawyers to ruin someone, or spending your precious energy trying to teach a lesson to people who are completely committed to misunderstanding you. The greatest revenge I ever took against my family was simply removing my hands from the steering wheel. I did not sabotage their vendor contracts. I did not force Megan to buy toxic synthetic chemicals. I did not make Jamal lie on federal loan applications. I did not force my parents to co-sign massive amounts of predatory debt. All I did was stop playing the role of their personal, continuous savior. I stopped doing the homework they refused to do. I established a firm absolute boundary, and I walked away. I let the natural consequences of their own breathtaking arrogance take over. I realized that toxic people do not actually need you to destroy them. If you just step out of their way and refuse to be their safety net, their own profound incompetence will eventually destroy them from the inside out. My family was a sinking ship long before I ever walked into that boardroom. I just finally decided to stop using my own body to plug the holes they kept drilling into the hull. For 35 years, I had carried a heavy knot of anxiety in my chest. I used to wake up every single morning wondering what new crisis my sister had created and how much money it was going to cost me to fix it. I used to agonize over what I had to achieve just to get a simple word of praise from my mother. That knot is completely gone now. The silence in my life is no longer lonely. It is the beautiful, peaceful silence of a woman who answers to absolutely no one but herself. Society constantly conditions women to believe that family is everything. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to keep the peace, and to sacrifice our own success to make sure our relatives feel comfortable. But blood does not automatically grant someone the right to abuse your kindness and steal the fruits of your labor. Sometimes the most empowering thing you can do for yourself is to recognize that the people who share your DNA are the exact people you need to cut out of your life entirely. If you are listening to this story right now, and you are currently dealing with a toxic family dynamic, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You do not owe your abusers your success. You do not owe them your peace of mind. It is incredibly terrifying to walk away from the only family you have ever known. The guilt they have planted inside you will try to convince you to turn around and save them. Do not do it. Keep walking. The life you can build when you stop carrying their dead weight is more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Share your experiences, because you never know who might desperately need to read your words today. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe in setting boundaries and taking back control of your life. I turned away from the balcony edge and walked back into my beautifully lit executive office. My desk was clear, my mind was focused, and my future was completely my own. I thought about the words my father had spoken to me on that fateful afternoon in Chicago. He had placed his hand on my shoulder and ordered me to surrender my life work. He told me to step aside so my sister could have the life she deserved. And looking at her now, living in our parents' damp, unfinished basement with a mountain of federal debt and a ruined reputation, I guess she finally got exactly what she earned. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that your worth is not defined by how much abuse you can absorb from the people who share your DNA. Society constantly conditions us to believe that family is an absolute, unbreakable bond. We are taught that we must constantly sacrifice our own peace of mind to protect them from their own terrible decisions. But loyalty should never be a one-way street where you do all the heavy lifting and they do all the taking. I spent 35 years believing I had to be their permanent financial and emotional safety net. What I finally realized is that you cannot save people who are completely determined to destroy you for their own comfort. True power does not come from screaming, arguing, or seeking aggressive, malicious revenge. True power comes from the absolute refusal to participate in your own exploitation. When you are dealing with toxic, entitled individuals, you do not need to actively plot their downfall. All you have to do is establish a firm boundary step out of their way and let them experience the natural, devastating consequences of their own incompetence. Letting go of my family felt incredibly terrifying at first because it went against everything I was taught. But ultimately, it was the only way I could truly breathe. If you are carrying the heavy weight of ungrateful people right now, please understand that dropping that weight does not make you a selfish person. It makes you free. You have the right to build a beautiful life that is authentically yours, surrounded by people who respect your boundaries and genuinely celebrate your success. You are the author of your own story, and you have the absolute right to write out the characters who bring you nothing but pain. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community of strong, independent individuals.